go. This is my favorite series that we do every year, partially because kind of my story growing up, if you didn't know, is I am very much type A, empirical data, left brain, science, math. I don't really like subjects where there's more than one answer. I think that's garbage, you know? I feel like that, like if you had some kid would show up in your English class high and he'd be like, well, I think Romeo and Juliet's about spacecrafts. And your teacher would be like, that's great. I'm like, no, you're empirically wrong, right? And I want that. And so when I was growing up, I kept going to church, and there was this idea of faith biblically. And what I grew up thinking to myself and being told is the more evidence you have for God, the less you require faith, and therefore there's no evidence for God. Because if there was evidence for God, then you wouldn't need faith. Therefore, there is no evidence, there is no proof, there is no logical reasoning that points to a creator, that points to Jesus. There's just nothing for it. And I just, doesn't that feel like just this cosmic cop-out of using your brain? Like, oh, well, don't worry, there's no evidence. He hid all the evidence. And it's like, well, if this God's main objective is the salvific nature of his children, like if his main goal in coming, John says, was that we would have eternal life, why the frick would you hide yourself inside of creation or outside of creation so that no one could find you? That seemed like a petty, pithy, ridiculous, just fundamentally juxtaposed to any reason. Doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? So I jumped on board the atheism train and rode that train for a bit and thought that this has got to have better answers. Because I would go to church and my youth pastor would say, it doesn't matter, just play dodgeball. And then I would go back to my biology class and they were like, no, we've got answers for everything. And I found out that both sides were wrong. And that was a difficulty. And that's what I want to challenge you with in this series is the implications of a book that are sitting on many of your laps right now is that not just that you're bigger than an accident. You're not a grown-up germ or a moist robot. You're not stardust. You're not a bag of molecules. You are not just atoms in motion. The book sitting on many of your laps called the Bible says that not only is there a God, but he's interacted with mankind. And his interaction with mankind actually created some kind of accountability where when God interacted with mankind, he said, the reason you exist is to bring me glory. And so a lot of us are asking that, and in a world where we are all just accidents, then meaning is absolutely meaningless. Okay, so just make sure we're clear. And that's one of the things I really want to pitch in this whole series is to point out different thoughts that I had growing up that with one simple conversation with an intelligent Christian, we just ripped apart. And I thought to myself, you know, I had meaning in my life, but it wasn't God. And this guy said, there's no such thing as meaning if there is no God. And I said, no, what are you talking about? And he said, every bit of meaning that you feel inside of yourself is just your grown-up amoeba brain fizzing, trying to stay alive and not get eaten. And you call that meaning. Do you really think it's worth pursuing? Do you really think there is a higher moral code? Do you really believe these things to be true? And it was really kind of shocking for me. So I want to make sure we're logically consistent through this whole thing as we're talking through what is the evidence for God's existence and what are the best evidences against God's existence. What I would like to postulate to many of us who walked in here, and I know a lot of you guys, you're not believers, but you came because you're intrigued by this, would be that you don't live your life in sound bites and extremes. Because the argumentation for God's existence and non-existence doesn't exist in the sound bites and the extremes. To walk in and go, you know, I've gone into debates before with like evolutionary biologists who walked in and said, well, there's actually no evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed either. And I went, no, where did you hear that from? Like, who told you that? I mean, N.T. Wright, these New Testament scholars, these people who aren't even, they're not even believers would say, there was a Jesus, he did live, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate underneath Roman rule, he was claimed to have been seen again after he died. These are facts. But if you don't study it yourself, here's my fear. My fear is that you as Christians will walk your whole life presupposing that everything's based on faith, and you're not going to really have a conviction in your heart of why it's true. If you don't have a conviction that God is real, you're going to live as kind of this wishy-washy, half-assed Christian. I said half-assed. I put a K in there, so it's no longer inappropriate. It's in like this half way of living your life, and it's just stupid. It's like you don't get to taste the full measure of who God is if you just assume that we're supposed to take everything on blind faith. When you look at history, when you look at science, when you look at biology, when you watch the way it lines up with cosmology, there's something inside the soul of a Christian when you understand those things that breathes this collective sigh of relief and says, there's beauty to be found in this world. Intrinsic beauty, not just formulated from my brain beauty, but real beauty in this world. Conversely, if you are of the atheist or agnostic mindset, the Bible that we believe to be true says that you are not allowed to play an impassive role towards the book. That it says that on your last day you will die, and because you are an immortal soul with a mortal body, though your mortal soul will die, your immortal part of you, the immaterial, will live on, and you'll meet that God face to face. And it will not be okay for you to go, well, I don't care. I didn't care. I didn't have an answer. So you might finish this series more skeptical than when you walked in, more of an atheist than when you walked in, but at least have an answer, for God's sakes. You know what I mean? Like, there's 2.5 billion people on this planet are of the Christian belief system. About 6 billion people believe in a divine power. The majority of everyone you're ever going to rub shoulders with or see eyeball to eyeball are going to believe that there's a God. And if you just walk around going, well, I don't think that there is, that's it. Like Bertrand Russell, that's what he said. The universe is, that's all that there is, and it just is. That's not really an answer. That's a non-answer. That's what a second grader says. So I want to challenge both sides. Christians lean in, atheists lean in, and inquire. And that's why on Sunday nights we're doing the forum, which is going to enable you to ask questions. It's just an hour and 15 minutes of Q&A. And I would push you, like, don't walk out of these doors and hang out with the people who brought you and just go, well, what he said about this was wrong, and what he said in this is wrong. Because there's no audience there. What that is fear. There's no good pushback. And so I've been walking in and doing these different debates at the different colleges. What I've realized is I show up with a gun, and this guy brought a knife. Not because there's great arguments for God's non-existence out there. But they're so used to just going, well, all Christians are bigots, and if God was so good, then why is there evil in this world? And you answer those two questions, and then they go, well, frick, that's all the arguments I had. So at least bolster up your position. So when you meet a Christian like me or someone else in this room, you've got something more intelligible to say than there's not a God because I watched this YouTube video of Naked Steve's Cheeto Diary where this guy sits in a beanbag chair and is like, well, there's no God, blah, blah, blah. Right? And you just go on Reddit and you believe these minimalistic, reductionistic beliefs of like, oh, there's a God, huh? Oh, so you're telling me that a woman who's a virgin gave birth to a man and he's created? That's so stupid. Is it stupid because you presuppose that miracles don't exist? What evidence do you have that miracles don't exist? Do you believe why is that so ridiculous to believe? Do you believe that faith is something that we should have or that we shouldn't have? And if it's something that we shouldn't have, then is everything that you believe in your life void of faith, or is there great faith in your life? And if there is great faith in your life, then what do you have faith in? Because I guarantee you haven't done any science when it comes to cosmology, have you? Has anyone here studied the isotopes? Or has anyone here, you raise your hand if you believe that you have gone with Penzias and Wilson and you have discovered the COBE in 1994, which was a Nobel Prize-winning study to find out the cosmic microwave background radiation in the whole universe that shows the leftover. Can anyone give me a fundamental model of the inception of the universe? Anyone want to explain to me how we can see back to the very second that all of space-time was created? That's not to go, you're dumb. That is simply to say, you're going to have to trust someone on this. You're going to have to believe someone. Unless you're willing to do it. If you're not willing to do it, all you've done then is you've received someone else's data secondhand, and then they've interpreted it for you. And be clear on something. Science, is it beautiful? Yes. Is it great for discovering things? Yes. But the vast majority of everything in our world that is of meaning and that exists, science can't do anything with. Dark energy makes up 99.6% of everything in our universe, and science has no clue what it is. How much does justice weigh? Do the equal human rights fit in the scientific method? what I'd like to postulate to you is that science can do a lot of great things, but when it comes to the inception of the universe, why we are here, the bigger cosmic questions, science can't really do anything. And if you just go, well, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, there's an issue there because science only deals with that which is observable, measurable, and repeatable. And everything meaningful in our life doesn't fit there. It can tell us how that an object in motion remains in motion unless acted on by an outside object. That's great. Fantastic. Is it wrong that rape exists in our world? Well, objects in motion, no, nothing that you're saying is meaningful. And even science itself, if you go, well, it can be scientifically proven. Science also assumes that tomorrow is going to be like today, doesn't it? Science assumes that everything in free fall drops at 9.8 meters per second in a vacuum, right? Science assumes that when I drop my phone, that gravity was going to pull it towards the most nuclear dense object, which is the Earth's core, right? That's why it's going down right there. But what science can't do is argue ontologically why. If we should trust science, and this is the way the conditions of the world are right now, if we believe that everything to be based on science, we're just assuming that the next minute's going to be like the last minute. But based on what worldview? If everything is just is a cosmic accident, what would give us any assurance that the next minute's going to be like the present minute? Now, on theism, we say that God holds everything together. In the book of Job, it says he stretches out the skies. He holds things in motion. The book of Romans then reciprocates. The book of Romans chapter 1 says that all energy in a system breaks down over time, which is our law of thermodynamics. So there's something to be said on both sides. What I want you to do is I want you to have, Christian or not, a reason for how you orient your life. And make no mistake, that is the argument at hand right here. How do you orient your life? What does your life mean? And to understand that if you are strictly speaking an agnostic or an atheist, well, I guess atheist, all meaning, all love, all value, all intrinsic human worth is a result of wee bags of stardust making judgment calls that are literally just opinions. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the moral argument. But tonight, we're going to dive into what's called the cosmological argument for God's existence, which means we want to go back to the beginning of time, and that the beginning of time actually points the proof. It is more reasonable than not that God exists. That's what a proof means in physics and in philosophy. That based on the premises we draw, if they are logical, and the conclusion follows from the premises, it is more reasonable than not that that conclusion exists. Here are your premises for tonight. This is a cosmological argument. Cosmology is the study of the beginning of all things and how they interact with each other. So the cosmological argument for God's existence is in three parts. The most basic way that we argue in logic and philosophy is called modus ponens, which means if P, then Q, then we affirm P and it gives us our Q value. Okay, so if you are a man or woman, then you are mortal. Okay, that's if P, then Q. If P, you are a man or woman, then Q, you are mortal. The second part of modus ponens is we affirm the antecedent, which is the first thing. So we have to affirm the first part. So if I said, if my whole point was I want to prove that Sam Graham is mortal, I would say, well, here's how it follows. If you are a man or a woman, then you are mortal. Sam Graham is a woman. What's my therefore? Therefore, Sam is mortal. That's modus ponens. That's the simplest way of arguing. No one pushes back on that. You affirm the antecedent, and if the conclusion follows justly, then your premise is true. So here's the first point. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the first part of the cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. If you want to skip ahead, Luke, to my argument from cosmology, I actually have these up on my slides. You can keep going. Keep going. That's Sam Harris. That's that. That's more stuff. Yep. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Right there. Okay. Premise one. Everything that begins to exist has an external cause for its existence, or has a cause. You don't need to write that down if you don't want to. So if P, then Q. That's that little PQ up there. Premise two. The universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Number 2, the universe began to exist. So if P then Q, premise 2 says P is affirmed. The universe began to exist. That's our Sam Graham in this argument. The universe is our Sam Graham. But if everything began to exist as a cause, and we say the universe began to exist, our natural implication then is that the universe has a cause. Good. That's our conclusion at the bottom. The universe has a cause outside of itself. Okay? Or we can just say the universe has a cause. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has cause. That's the cosmological argument. Okay? It was originally penned by Leibniz, and then Kalam, who's actually a devout Muslim, came up with. He helped perfect it, and then William Lane Craig took it and spent about 6 years perfecting it and came up with this modern postulation for God's existence. On the left, you'll see Albert Einstein. On the right, you'll see this man named Georges Lemaitre. He's a French guy. I don't know how to say his name because I don't take French. But they're basically the ones who are responsible with helping us understand past time, that we can talk meaningfully about past time. So that is the premise. So in thought, if our conclusion, which is at the bottom, makes sense from our premises, then all we have to do is prove our premises true. If we can prove, and I mean prove, our premises true, and our conclusion makes sense based on our premises, then we would say this is an airtight, truth-tabled fact. This is a truism. Okay? So, what do we have to prove then? 2 things. First thing we have to prove is what? Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Now, how do we do that? Some people's natural pushback to premise 1 is, well, that's not true. There's some things that just begin to exist out of nothing, like quarks or subatomic particles. We've observed subatomic particles that just bleep into existence. Okay? Here's the pushback to that. Every subatomic particle that we've ever seen existed inside of what? That we all dwell in all the time. You don't even realize you're in it right now. There's a continuum called the space-time continuum. So the argument that you're making is inside of the matter, materials, elements of our universe, we watch these things blip. The issue is, prior to having the space-time continuum and all these materials, nothing blipped. Because nothing is only capable of doing one thing, which is nothing. That's the first rule of astrophysics. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Nothing does nothing. Nothing isn't space, because space is something. Nothing is nothing. Don't think of a dark room. Don't think of a closet. Don't think of, look, there's nothing between my hands. That's actually completely false. A lot of germs from my family members, maybe some of your hands that I shook, are between my hands right now. There's space. Okay, there's particles. There's probably dead skin from some of you people just floating around our room right now. There is something between my hands. Okay? Not to mention space. There is space between my hands. Nothing isn't empty space. It's spaceless. So, the argument is, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. And so you might go, well, what about the subatomic particles? That doesn't make any sense. The next pushback someone might have is, well, if everything that begins to exist has to have a cause, then if you're arguing for God, then what caused God? Okay, that's called a category error. A category error in logic is when you've mistaken 2 things, right? Like if I said, who's the fastest person in this room? And then you said, well, cheetahs are faster. Well, that's not the question. That was a completely different topic entirely. So when you say, well, what caused God's existence? There's an issue with that question. It's begged. When we say, well, you beg the question, it means you assume something that we didn't agree on. The very first premise was the very first line say, everything that begins to exist. So the whole argument is God didn't begin to exist. He is infinite. He is eternal. He doesn't need a cause for his existence. That means that he is necessary in being. Necessary means he exists out of his own nature. His nature is existence. He doesn't need to be created. Are you a necessary being? No, 9. You are a contingent being, which means you exist because something made you exist, right? If your parents didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. And if their parents didn't exist, they didn't exist. And so Leibniz, his original argument was, no matter what you find in all of the universe, everything is contingent on something else, but then eventually would have to stop. Otherwise, it'd be an infinite regression of nothingness. So, Liz, what are your parents' names? Debbie? Okay, what's Debbie's mom's name? What's Catherine's mom's name? You don't know. But eventually you get to a point where there'd be the first humans and you would go, oh, I don't know what caused them to exist. Trees, same thing. Well, this came from this tree, this came from this tree. And then, but if you do this, if you push the rewind button on all of human history, there'd be a point at which everything came back to one simple what we call singularity. And if that singularity is the beginning of all space-time, then before there was space, time, and material, there was nothing. Nothing contingent. The only thing that could still exist are things that are necessary. God would therefore be a necessary being. What's something else that's necessary? Can you name something else? Can you figure out something else that's necessary, that exists by its own nature? There's a couple things. What? Chocolate. No, but that's good, Mark. The laws of logic exist in and of themselves. Numbers are necessary entities, right? Numbers, they don't need to be created, or they're just ideas. They always exist, right? If there were 0 humans on the planet, there would still be 0 humans on the planet, even if there wasn't a human around to go, there are 0 humans here. That fact would still be true without there needing to be people. So numbers are ideas that exist necessarily. So that's a false argument to say, well, then what caused God? No, that's a category error. Nothing caused God. The argument he is a necessary being. He didn't come into existence. He didn't begin to exist. He is infinite in the past. So, without any other pushback from premise 1, we can say it is more plausible that that is true than that it is false. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Then we move on to premise 2. And now where our job is to prove premise 2 true, which is, did the universe begin to exist? Did the universe begin to exist? And here's what's crazy. What's crazy is growing up, when people would talk about the Big Bang, Christians would pucker up. They'd be like, the Big Bang, oh no, it's terrifying. And now, here's what you don't realize. When the Big Bang Theory was originally constructed on a series of different, can you find the slide that has the timeline of the Big Bang model as we know it today? When the Big Bang model was first being discussed, the most terrified group of people, I'll see if it's up here, right there. The most terrified group of people when the Big Bang Theory was first being discussed were atheists, because they understood something. You have to understand this. The Big Bang model smacks, that means it calls out for, I'm quoting Stephen Hawking verbatim. Stephen Hawking said, if we could prove a cosmic beginning, it would prove a point at which all science broke down. It would require, and I quote, an intelligent designer. It smacks of intelligent design. Then, a series of events happened. In 1850 was when we first understood entropy. Entropy is that all matter or all energy inside of a contained system breaks down over time. Okay? So imagine you have an oven, okay? And you open that oven door. What happens to all of the heat inside the oven when you open that oven door? Does it all sit self-contained inside of the oven? No, what does it do? It releases. It fills space. So the argument from entropy is that energy fills space and it goes away. So there's only a certain amount of usable energy in our universe, and it's dying. It's going away. So it can't be a steady state. It's all breaking down, which means this has some implications, which we'll talk about here in a second. So remember, inside of a system, all energy starts to disperse and get lesser over time. Point number one. Point number two, in 1915, a man named Albert Einstein, he came up with a theory of relativity. Maybe you've heard of this. The issue is there's actually someone who is smarter than him, who is a priest named Georges Lemaitre. I don't know if I said it right again. But he came up to Albert Einstein, and Albert Einstein, his whole theory of relativity allowed us to speak meaningful about past events. He made a system by which we could start talking about events that occurred 1 and 2 billion years ago, just theoretically, because we didn't have the actual tools to find them yet. Here's the issue. He didn't consider time as a factor in talking about the past. He made a huge whoops. That's German for oops, okay? He made a big mistake. He even said, it's the biggest blunder of my life was to not include time in my theory of relativity. Well, it's fixed then in Lemaitre, and he comes up with this theory that the universe is expanding, and it came from one hot nuclear dense point. And at the time, this was almost like a Christian worldview, but he wasn't a Christian. He said, I think there was a point at which everything began because he started to realize that if we've got heat in our universe, it must have come from some point because heat breaks down. So there must have been some super hot thing in order for us to have any usable heat still in our universe. And it had to have come from a single point because just do the math. If the universe is infinitely old, what would there not be anywhere in our universe? What would be gone and all used up now? Energy. There'd be none left. It wouldn't work. So he said, well, first of all, it had to have started a finite time ago because we still have energy, and it must have been super hot because we still have heat. Okay? Then Hubble, you might know him because he made a really big telescope called the Hubble telescope. He started looking at distant galaxies, and guys, maybe your brain already hurts, but let me trip you out really quick. We can watch we can see, this is great, we can see what the universe looked like 11 billion years ago. We can see it. Because the light from a galaxy 11 billion light years away, when we look in our telescope and we see it, are we seeing that galaxy or that star or that supernova as it exists today? No. We're seeing it as it existed when? It took 11 billion years for that light to hit my telescope, which means I'm literally watching. When I look at something 11 billion light years away, I don't see it now. I see it as it used to be 11 billion years ago, which means a lot of the things that we see in our far-reaching telescopes no longer exist. But when we look in their direction, the light is still traveling to us like, we've been coming for a long time. But if you were able to transport yourself there right now, it would all be different, it would all be gone. So his theory of relativity allowed us with Hubble to look at these far galaxies, and he looked at the light refracting off of these stars, and he realized, hold on, our universe it's getting bigger. But it's not that galaxies are falling away from each other, it's that the space, this is going to hurt your brain too, the space in between our galaxies is getting bigger. The space itself is getting bigger. This is called dark energy. It's a stretching motion that there's this thing called dark energy, and it just stretches. And no one knows what the frick it is. It just stretches. So you don't care, whatever. 1929, we were able to discover that. Then people said, okay, well, here's what happened then. To avoid a singularity, which means a point at which everything began before there'd be nothing, to avoid that, people started going, well, maybe it's a steady state universe. Maybe the universe has always been this way. Why doesn't that work? If the universe has always been this way, which theories would cancel that out immediately? Entropy would, because there'd be nothing left. The theory of relativity would, because then why are we watching things expand? And the red light shift says the heat and the motion away, everything's getting further away from each other. So if everything's going like this, if you pushed rewind, what would happen? And you can't go the other direction. That doesn't make any sense. There's such thing as negative space. So you'd all start at one point. So the steady state model was killed. People said, well, oh, in order to have there not be a God, let's do the oscillating model. So it's like the universe is like an accordion. It just keeps doing this infinitely. We see the universe expanding, but that's because it just goes like this. The universe expands and contracts, and it always has, infinitely. What are the issues with that? One, relativity is still a problem. Number two, in 1978, this group, who won the Nobel Prize, found that there is heat left over from the original bang in our universe. It's about 5 degrees above absolute zero. In the far reaches of our universe, there's a measurable amount of heat left over, like a shock wave from the heat. So we know it's only happened one time. In 2006, Board, Blanken, and Guth were hired by a man named Stephen Hawking to give a State of the Universe address. And Vilenkin says this. He says, this is important for us to understand. We are now faced with the proposition of how the universe came to be without the hand of a transcendent creator. He said, any universe that's expanding had to have come back to one point. We have now allowed a divine foot in the door. He's not a Christian. He's not a theist. He's a devout atheist, but his studies lead him to say, I think we've got to, here's what he says, we have to go once again into the sticky discourse of how the universe came to be without the hand of a transcendent creator. It's kind of freaky, right? Especially if you walked in here and you're kind of that, and I love that you're here, but if you're sitting there with that devout atheistic standpoint, isn't it terrifying to hear Stephen Hawking say, look, if we could prove a point at which everything began, it would be a cosmic hiccup, because then you'd have to appeal to a transcendent creator. And then Board, Blanken, and Guth, they come with a theorem that says there was a point at which everything began, therefore there's a transcendent creator. It happens again and again, and then every model, look, if Christianity or if theism were false, wouldn't your natural hypothesis be that the smarter we got and the more well-informed we became and the more we discovered about the universe, if this whole God thing is some archaic hoax, wouldn't information always move us further away from the God hypothesis? Wouldn't it always push us further away from there being a God if it was actually false? Right? The more information we gather on anything, the better we are to make a decision. But the more information we're getting about these topics, you guys, the more we are crying out for one hypothesis being true, which is the God hypothesis, which should be scary. This is what terrified me as a 17-year-old kid who thought that God was just some cosmic. This was terrifying for me. You can go to the next slide there, Luke. So here's the variables. Here's what people have thought of historically. Well, this is how you get around God. Number one, the static state. Problem. The refutation of that. Okay, you ready for your brains to hurt again? Maybe they are just constantly in a state of hurt right now, okay? It's impossible. The theory of eternal pastime is impossible, even philosophically. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say, Leah, can you start counting? Start counting to infinity. Ready, go. Okay, stop. Good. You were doing great. Now I want you to count backwards from infinity. Ready, go. What's the next number? It's not, because what is infinity? Is infinity a number? What is it? It's an idea. Good. It's just never ending. So if you say, well, the universe is infinitely in the past, well, the universe has always been here. It's infinite pastime. The issue with that is it would be impossible for us to have a present. Why? Because there could always be one more yesterday before the yesterday before the yesterday, so we should actually never get here. It's even philosophically, it's impossible for us to have today if the universe were eternal in the past. Because there could always be one more day before today. So philosophically, it's refuted. Cosmic expansion refutes it. Entropy refutes it. And there's absolutely no evidence to support it. In fact, the whole Big Bang model, this guy named Sir Fred Hoyle, he was this astrophysicist, and he jokingly went, because there was this new thing coming out, and he called it the Big Bang Theory. He was mocking it, because he was like, the universe has always been here. So he mocked it and called it the Big Bang Theory as a joke. And then turns out his steady state model was wrong, and now we all call it what? The Big Bang model of the universe. What about eternal pastime? We've already done that. The nothing hypothesis. The nothing hypothesis is everything came from nothing. This is Bertrand Russell. The universe just is, and that's it. Don't ask questions. Isn't this like when you had every reason to ask your mom if you could go out to the bowling alley with your friends, and she said, no, you can't, and you said, why? And she just said, because. You were like, that's not a reason. That's a lack of reason. When you do that, it's just, what are you talking about? And Christians we always get told, well, all you do, whenever you can't explain something, you say, well, God made it that way. What did you just say? Well, how did the universe come from? I don't know. Shut up. Was that good science? The multiverse, this one's really popular right now, but what if there isn't just one universe? What if there's 100 billion universes, and in our universe, this is the only one we see, but there's other universes out there? Well, here's the issue with that. Vlanken didn't say that our universe in particular needed a beginning. He said, any universe on average that has been expanding must have a finite past, which means even if there's a multiverse, even if there's 100 billion universes out there, if one of them is expanding, then what's true of it? It all had to have a beginning. So I'll grant it, fine. There's no proof for a multiverse. There's no proof for anything except for our universe. There's no science. It's completely faith-based. It's a religious position to hold if you're a scientist, to say that maybe there's a whole bunch of universes that we have no clue and no empirical evidence of. Fine, you can have it. Now, here's the other issue. That doesn't change the fact that there would still need to be a beginning, and before the beginning was nothing. It just pushes it back, right? It's like, my dad can beat up your dad. No, my dad can beat up your dad. No, my dad can beat up your dad. It's like, this is stupid. The Big Crunch model, that's the oscillating universe. That was killed by entropy. It was killed by cosmic microwave background radiation, that glimmer of heat left over from the original expansion. And then number 6 is intelligent design. Here's some good refutation for intelligent design. Well, then where is he? Why not make himself obvious to us? Well, if that really is the case, then why is there evil in the world? If there is a God, then is he just leaving us alone? We've never tested God. You can't test him. He can't be proven empirically. There is no science that backs the fact that there's a God. Well, you're completely right. God would by nature not fit in science because he is not natural, observable, measurable, or repeatable. So of course, listen, this is very important. I've known Christians who teach biology and they teach evolution in the classroom and they have no issue with it. You want to know why? They teach the multiverse in their classroom, and I ask them why, and they go, well, that's what science is. Science is the best explanation inside of naturalism we can get. Well, do you believe that God made it? Yeah, I do. Well, why don't you teach it? Because that's not science. You can't say God made it and still be a scientist. It's impossible. Those are called NOMA principles. That means non-overlapping magisterial authorities. That means they don't overlap with each other. When you start saying a natural science that a supernatural thing, it's no longer science. So yes, scientists are not allowed to believe in God. They're not allowed to do science to get there because it is by nature supernatural, and science deals with that which is natural. So as a scientist, you can't come to the conclusion, I think God did it. You're not just getting fired because you're bringing religion into it, because you're not doing science. The theory of evolution, the theory of all these things are all based on you can't appeal to something greater. What's your best guess? Which is why evolution is brilliant. That is why all these things, the multiverse is brilliant, because you took away the answer from someone and asked them the question, and they came up with some really crazy cool stuff. It's just not true. There's just no evidence for it. I love, this is what Alvin Plantinga, president of the American Philosophical Association, said. To believe in a multiverse or the Big Crunch model, you might as well reject the evidence for the Earth's being round by pointing out that there are possible worlds in which we have all the evidence we have in this world, but the Earth is flat. So his whole point is, this is a non-point again. What you're saying is, well, what if there was another world where we had all the evidence in this world that we did have, and in that world there wasn't a beginning? Well, that he's a philosophers. Richard Dawkins said this. If you don't know Richard Dawkins, he's one of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse with Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. Militant atheist, hates religion. Here's what he said. As it turns out, the serial version of the multiverse must now be judged less likely than it once was because recent evidence is starting to steer us away from the big crunch model. It now looks like our own universe is destined to expand forever. And, Valenkin said, any universe which is on average expanding must have a point at which it all began. So if you can prove a beginning where everything, where space-time began, if you can prove there was a point at which everything began, you are stuck with one solution, and only one. You can't borrow anything that is in space, anything that is in time, and anything that is material. So we're looking for a solution. We're looking for something that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and it can't be contingent, which means the being has to be necessary. So we need a necessary, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, intelligent, omnipotent. That means he's got to have the power. If he created all of space-time, he, she, it, they, whatever, created all of space-time, it must be more powerful than all of space-time because nothing is greater than that which created it. So that's what we're searching for. So back to our, you can go down, next slide. Right there. We have names for people who have many beliefs for which there is no rational justification. This is Sam Harris, one of the atheists of the apocalypse. When their beliefs are extremely common, we call them religious. Otherwise, they are likely to be called mad, psychotic, or delusional. Clearly, there is sanity in numbers, and yet it is merely an accident of history that it is considered normal in our society to believe in a creator of the universe. That's what he said. But what did he say at the beginning? People who have beliefs for which there is no rational justification ought to be locked up and considered loony. But every working model of the universe outside of there being a God has been factually and scientifically proven false. There's a guy named Lerner who admitted, what? I said Lerner? Was that a funny word? He admitted that there's no way to get around God, so guess what he did? He rejected entropy. He wrote a book where he said, the second law of thermodynamics is false. So he said, well, the reason we can get around God by just simply rejecting that all energies in a system break down over time. And you go, what? But everything in our universe depends on that law being true in order for you to sit here today. Even your body depends on entropy to have the thoughts it has so you can come up with the philosophy that maybe the second law of thermodynamics isn't true. That doesn't make any sense. You're sawing off the branch you're sitting on. It's like, well, what if there's no entropy? Then there's no stars, there's no expansion of the universe. You need to reject everything we know about space-time. You yourself shouldn't have common thought. Everything's gone. You can keep going. So that's rude and it's wrong because each have faith. Hypothesis the universe had a beginning. Keep going. Drawing conclusions, the implications of a beginning. If there's a point at which the universe came into existence, prior to that point, the universe did not exist. The universe includes space and time. Before the beginning, there was neither space nor time. And out of nothing, nothing comes. All physical reality was nothing. The universe can't cause itself, right? That's just existentially, experientially, ontologically true, right? If something could cause itself, then it would have already existed. Doesn't make any sense. That is reductio ad absurdum. Something outside of our universe caused our universe to exist. It would have had to, because if there was nothingness, everything contingent began at the point at the singularity, so it had to be outside of space, time, and material. Something outside of our universe caused the universe to exist, would help make our observations rational. This thing must be transcendent, timeless, spaceless. Keep going. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications whenever you start discussing the origin of the universe, said Stephen Hawking, theoretical physicist. Thomas Nagel, PhD, philosophy, NYU. No, we'll do that one later on. Keep going, go down. David Hume. I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. professor of physics. There is no problem with Big Bang cosmology and the singularity, but was originally rejected by the scientific community because it gave in to the Judeo-Christian idea of the beginning of the world and seems to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took mountains of irrefutable evidence for the scientific community to accept the cosmic genesis, that means the beginning, a successful model that imposed itself on a reluctant scientific community. I'll read from this second half down. It's talking about the same thing. That there are now supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. For the scientist who has lived by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer his highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So they go, we figured it out. There was a beginning. And a bunch of second graders sitting there with a Bible going, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God stretches out. He stretches out. That's the word in Hebrew. It says he stretches out, and it's in the call in the Hifal tense, which means when it says in Jeremiah and Job and Psalms that God stretches out the universe, it means he both stretched it out and continues to stretch it out today. So it's a point in the past, and it continues to today, which is everything we know to be true about dark energy and matter and the expansion of our universe and the cosmological constant and what we know to be true about the relativity of our world and our universe even to this point today. You can go to the next one. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has an external cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, which means space, time, and matter began to exist, which means the universe has a cause outside of itself. That cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, which is what everyone means when they say God. A being that is all-powerful, doesn't exist inside of our space, inside of our time, inside of our circumstances, unless he wants to. And that's the beauty of the Christian faith, is it goes the next level and says, not only do we have a God who's spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, we have a God who then painted himself into time, into space. He put on flesh to become one of us in order to save us. Now, the cosmological argument for God's existence does not prove Christianity true at all. What it does do is it puts a burden of proof on an atheist to go, the cosmic beginning, give me a model that disproves God. We've taken the burden of proof. We've tested every one that the scientific community has ever thrown at us. The only one that I can't refute is the, well, no one can know principle. That's what I've been told in debates. Well, no one can know at the beginning of the universe. You know what that's called? A faith statement. You don't know that no one can know. That's not empirically tested. That's not the scientific method. That's not true. That isn't a truism. That can be negated on a truth table. There's nothing empirically true about that statement. For the Christian, we have to have answers 1 Peter 3 talks about for the hope that lies within us. And if you're sitting here and you're not a believer and you're against it, I want you to wrestle with this stuff and go, then what could it be? And you've got to trust someone, unless you're willing to do the research yourself. You got to trust someone. You got to trust their math. And I would challenge you, don't trust someone. Do it yourself. But might I just prod you in the direction of being a self-seeker, of figuring it out for yourself? I'm not trying to force Christianity down your throat, but I am trying to pull you out of the stream that you swim in as an American teenager that inundates you with no God, no possibility, no way, and go, if you jump up into the realm of astrophysics, what you find is these people who are winning these Nobel Prizes, like Albert Einstein, was a theist. He believed there was a God. Newton, they all believed it. Now, he'd be a deist. He didn't believe that there's a Christian God. But these people they're still saying, when you do the math up here, when you get down here into your high schools, it's really easy to jump on Reddit and go, no God, simplistic phrases, yay, sound bites and extremes. But when you actually jump into that realm and start asking hard questions, what's your conclusion? And my proposition is the conclusion that you come to on whether or not there is a God reorients all of who you are. Because you're either a grown-up germ and your life is meaningless and there is no meaning and there's no purpose worth speaking of, and you thinking rape is wrong is your opinion, or there is a God, there's a higher objective standard for which there is all truth, and he has called out to you in the darkness and wants you. But those two things are not congruent with one another. Have an answer, whichever side you lie on. Don't forget, tomorrow night we're going to open up to Q&A. So if you have any questions in regards to this, we're going to have this up online tomorrow. So if you have a skeptical friend, you want to give it to them and let them come just roast me with questions tomorrow night, give it to them. They can do that. We'll be teaching similar material tomorrow morning as we continue our series on the skeptics. So we'll see you guys then.